And so we'll get into some of the other questions and the question we ask in the lesson. But I would just ask first, what words or thoughts do you see in those verses that might indicate that this is an extension of what we've just been talking about in Galatians 5? I'm sorry, there was several there. Restore, okay? So when you see the word restore, Paul, what kind of makes you think about what we've been talking about?
Bring them back to God.
Bring them back to God, okay? So that word about, it's the same, if you didn't study on that word, it's putting things back whole, it's mending a net, it's resetting a bone, it's taking something that is broken or fractured and helping it get back in a position where it can be made whole. Was there another word? Gentleness, I heard, okay? So why is gentleness time together, Cody? Ooh, that's a good visual, thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent visual. So, and where have we just recently heard the word gentleness? It's one of the aspects of the fruit of the Spirit, right? And I do love, and I think it's important that Paul talks about fruit of the Spirit in the singular, that these are all aspects of the same growth. But one of those aspects is gentleness. And it is as if Paul is telling us, here is a practical example of where this aspect of the fruit of the Spirit can come into play. We talked about gentleness kind of in the abstract. It's one of the aspects of that fruit. Now here's a practical example where it comes into play. And as Cody said, if you've ever had someone come to you not in a spirit of gentleness, then you easily recognize the difference, right? The works of the flesh are evident, and the aspects of the fruit of the Spirit are evident also. So we've got gentleness. I think that definitely ties the two thoughts together. There's at least one more word or maybe a couple of words in those verses that kind of tie chapters 5 and 6 together in my mind. Law would be one for sure. And we're going to put a pin in that one, Carol, because that's a whole other conversation I think is really good. There's one other word that came to mind. You may have others. Considering yourself, how do you think that comes into play? And it's interesting that it says, especially in this place where you're trying to help someone else, when you're trying to help someone else, specifically right there, be careful. I wonder why.
Come off as being superior.
Okay, you don't want to display the wrong attitude, and you might be tempted to do. It says, lest you be tempted. What would you be tempted to do in that scenario? Okay? Arrogant, superiority, or other words you might use, jealousy, division, anger. Any of those words sound familiar? Well, we just talked about some of those words, right? So, again, I don't think this is a completely separate conversation. Paul says, hey, there are going to be times when someone that you love, and he uses the word which is interesting, is overtaken in a fault. Use that word overtaken. What do you get from that? Anything specific come to mind when you hear the word overtaken in a fault? There's a struggle? Caught. It's in some versions caught in a transgression. So that's good. They're being pursued.
Recognize that. It wasn't necessarily this person just wandered down to sin.
They were pursued. They were caught. They've been overtaken. I don't think it's a stretch to say, maybe they don't even realize how much they've been captured. They don't even necessarily know exactly where they are, but they've been overtaken. So someone you love has been overtaken in a trespass. Who is supposed to go? You who are spiritual. What does it mean to be spiritual? Have the fruit of the Spirit, right? Again, you who, chapter 5, verse 25, who are keeping step with the Spirit, who are walking according to the Spirit. If you live according to the Spirit, if you're being animated, if you've been brought to life by the Spirit, then walk according to the Spirit. Those who are being led by the Spirit, those who have developed the fruit of the Spirit, is the one who is supposed to go do this restoring. Again, tie those things together. Don't assume that you're in a position to restore unless you have this fruit of the Spirit.
Also, you may have been tempted
Yes.
the same way.
And in that process, handle it the right way because you are going to be tempted as well. How we treat, a couple of quotes, how we treat one caught in sin reveals our heart. I think it's a good thought. Matt. Yes. Matt notes, and I think it's a fantastic point, the temptation is going to be likely to react in a non-gentle way. Why does he pull that specific aspect of the fruit out in this example? Because you're going to be tempted, because you're going to be frustrated, and you're going to be upset and disappointed, and all those emotions are going to be going on, and so you're going to be tempted to react in a non-gentle way when someone that you love is overtaken in sin. By the way, who or why? I'm going to answer it because I don't know how to ask it. Paul understood this. How do we know Paul understood this?
Corrected Peter not too long ago.
Peter was one example. The Galatians would be another, right? We've talked about how you can feel the frustration of Paul when he's writing this very letter, right? I am astonished that you are so quickly removed, right? Chapter 1. You foolish Galatians, chapter 3. So Paul understood this temptation because he was literally living it out as he was putting these words to paper. Yes? Yes.
Talking to the Galatians about the relationship that you got to be circumcised. You got to be circumcised. You got to be circumcised. We don't have to follow the law anymore. We can do whatever we want to do. Both of them were maybe competing with each other, saying we got, how are we going to reconcile this? I think Paul steps in verse 1 and says, problems there. We got to deal with these. We got to do it with gentleness and do it in the right way.
So Dad notes the end of Galatians 5, that very last verse of Galatians 5. Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying one another, is perhaps a window into what's happening in Galatia. The input of those who were trying to hold the law of Moses, the backlash of those who, that created a natural backlash, perhaps even of those who thought they weren't under any law. And so you can see when you have factions where that conceit and where that provoking comes. And instead, Paul would say, listen, even to those who are overcome in this Judaizing problem, who Paul, not too many verses ago, said, I wish they would emasculate themselves, right? That's the level that we're talking about. Even to those brethren, how can we come with the right spirit even to those brothers? I think if you read that verse in that light, it kind of gives me some sense of, I think in a lot of ways he's writing to the Galatians, but he's also working through his own thoughts here as well. Because how frustrated we know he is toward these Judaizing teachers. And he says we have to restore them in a sense of gentleness, bearing their burdens in verse 2. So as Carol notes, this is the Matthew 18 example, right? That we are to go We are to go to our brother or our sister and restore them. And now Paul tells us the attitude to do that with. So in verse 2, he says we are to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Yes?
Before we go on, going back to verse 1, we mentioned at the beginning of class, if you put your name on that list, people with spiritual qualities, but here Paul calls on us to have introspection.
Yeah.
If you are spiritual. And I think, I've got too much to work on. We talked about this in class on Wednesday. Peter makes a similar list of qualities, and at the end of that, his comment is, these qualities are yours and are increasing. Is my joy perfect? Is my patience perfect? No, is it there? It's there. It's there because I'm following Christ. It's there because I'm following His Spirit. And if I'm following His Spirit, I'm a spiritual person. If I'm a spiritual person, I have a responsibility. And then just a couple to that, what you were just saying. If gentleness can include going to Peter's face and saying you're wrong, gentleness can include writing a letter and saying the people that are tempting you should emasculate themselves. I think we need to recognize gentleness doesn't mean weak. Gentleness doesn't mean tiptoe. It means boldness, but boldness in the right way.
Yep. So weighing out, as Kyle noted, weighing out this desire for gentleness with the very things that we've seen Paul do pretty boldly is something that we all kind of have to weigh out. And as we've talked about, because this is a very different law, we're talking about this law of Christ, because this is a very different covenant than that old covenant where our actions were spelled out in minute detail. How gentle do we have to be? We all got to figure that out. That's the beauty of this thing, is that there's not a scale, there's not a scoreboard. How faithful do we have to be? How joyful do we have to be? How peaceful do we have to be? Opens good questions. Yes.
And I think too, if you go up to somebody you love, there's that possibility they're going to get upset.
Yes.
And then that leads down the whole rabbit hole of going through the other fruits, being patient. I'm doing it because I love them. It just kind of compounds on top of each other, and you end up doing everything.
Yeah, so Thomas makes a great point in that gentleness is certainly not the only fruit required in this scenario, right? Is if you're going to somebody or to someone you love, the tensions are highest with someone you love. It just naturally, I think it's that way. And so, yeah, you're going to go with gentleness, but as Thomas notes, you're probably going to find in that interaction, it's going to require love and patience and peacemaking and joy. All of these things come together. Paul isolates one, but it certainly would require all. Yes. Yes.
Gentleness close a lot of doors.
No question. No question. When someone is overtaken in a fault and it is not handled with these fruits of the Spirit, to Brad's point, there can be long tail implications. And so that makes this pretty serious pretty fast about how that I am going to approach someone. And I think verse 2 is important to that. When I approach this brother who I love, who's been overtaken in a fault, is my goal to add to their burdens or to bear them? And if I have that kind of attitude, I hope that I do have that kind of attitude. That makes a difference. Because remember, the ones who profess the closest hold to the law of Moses, what did Jesus say was their attitude when they went to someone in a fault? Matthew 23 says, specifically, Jesus says, you add to their burdens, right? Matthew 23, verse 4, I'll read it real quick. To the scribes and Pharisees, he says, you tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders. The attitude of these Judaizing teachers was, if one is overtaking in a fault, make sure they feel the weight of their burden and add to it. And Paul says, if you see someone overtaken in a fault, help bear their burden. That's a very, very different approach. And I think goes to what Brad noted about the outcome. Any other thoughts about bearing burdens on this one? Yes, sir.
That may not even imply that they've been overtaken in the fall, but
It's just like to add burdens, yes.
let's add burden to you.
Yes.
And so, if we read verse 2 in light of verse 1 in context, I think it's what it's talking about, but Moses needed his burden borne.
Yes.
And he wasn't overtaking the fall. He was trying to help others, and he needed people that would say, we'll help you bear that burden and lift your arms up.
Yes.
While you do the work.
Yeah, to Kyle's point, in context, I think we are talking about verse 1, those who have been overtaken in a fault. But just in general, we all need help with our burdens from time to time. And isn't that the point of this whole brothers in Christ exercise? But I would say particularly when one is overtaken in a fault. Christianity is not, or at least should not, be where we shoot our wounded, right? That is not, we take a little different attitude to those who are struggling. This word means to mend a bone, to put something out of place back together. Other thoughts on that?
The likelihood that you've been
100%.
so I mean, let's figure this out together.
Yes.
Here's what I do.
So Brad, again, makes a great point. All temptations are common, right? And failures are common. All of those works of the flesh, we sympathize with them because we've been in them. And so when someone is overtaken in a fault, there by the grace of God go I, that kind of idea, I've been there, I understand that. And I think that perhaps that is the point. I don't mean to skip ahead, but verse 6, we pull that verse out of context and think that's about compensation of teachers and compensation of preachers, and perhaps it can be used in that context. But more than that, in verse 6, let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. I wonder if that is more just a practical two people who have been in the same fault helping one another. That teaching is not, rarely is it strictly one-sided, that we're always learning from each other in the body. That, I have been asking, have taken the role of the teacher of this quarter, but I assure you, I've learned, the little comments after class, and I remember specifically things that Roger has mentioned to me after class, I've taken a note on, or John has mentioned to me after class, I've taken a note on, or comments in class. I think that is what it's talking about in verse 6, that even, we shouldn't get so haughty as to think we're only in a teaching position here when we are trying to restore this brother, but man, we are getting good things back. And then it gets into sowing the Spirit, right? And that all ties together. We are sowing to the Spirit. We're trying to help this brother, and it turns out that we get good things back in return. We learn about how others are going through temptations and trials, and we learn about the struggles others are having, and it makes us understand. So there is this cycle of if we sow to the Spirit, we reap spiritual things, even in this approaching this brother in a fault. Miss Carol. Yes.
That's what I tell my neighbors.
I think, so Carol notes that one of the characteristics of God's people, and she would note, she believes one of the characteristics here, and I believe she's true, I hope she's true, is this aspect of collective, collaborative study. That this is intended to be, we learn from each other, that we all have different perspectives and life's experiences, and if we come into this, verse 6, that the teacher doesn't come in and let me expound upon you everything I know, I'm so glorious, but rather how can we learn from one another? You get a much different Bible study experience. Nick. That's right. Yeah, yes. Yeah, two or three good things there, as Nick noted in his comment. One is just authenticity with one another. How do we understand each other's burdens that we can help bear unless we have some authenticity with one another? And I can't help with a burden that I don't know about. So we kind of need to know each other's burdens. Second, perhaps the reason that I went through this in the past is so I can help somebody who's going through this now. That's a very John 10 idea, right? Neither this man sinned nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God may be seen in him. How can this has happened not so that I can help someone else down the road so that the works of God could be seen in me? I think that's a very powerful thought, that I've gone through these things not just randomly because God doesn't like me, but because now I'm in a place where I can help somebody else who's going through those things. I think that's a very powerful idea.
Along the next point, recognize your walls.
Yes,
You have to know the other person, but you have to be willing to say, I got skeletons.
absolutely.
I don't want to give them all to you, but, they're there.
Yes,
Maybe I can help you with it.
yes.
So you have to be willing to,
You have to be authentic, and I think part of what you're saying there by implication is you got to be willing to spend time. Is that those relationships don't develop over the 3 minutes that happen in the foyer. They just can't and don't. And so if I really want to know what you're going through, there's going to have to be some authentic time that we spend together to understand where you're at and what you're going through. Those are all really good comments. The question that this passage often brings up, and that's question 1 in our lesson, is, what is the law of Christ? And I think this is really interesting, especially with everything we've been talking about in Galatians. We've talked about, hey, there's those who are trying to live under law, and we're not going to do a checklist, and this focus on the law is what is crushing you, Galatians. And now we're saying, but you are going to have to fulfill this law of Christ. And so help me with both parts of that question. What is the law of Christ? What do you take that to mean? And then secondly, what are the implications of Paul kind of using this phrase here? I'm anxious to hear your thoughts. Paul.
I think it's what Jesus taught and what he desires for me.
Okay, so Paul says the law of Christ must be the things that Jesus taught and what he desires of us. So I think that's an aspect. Paul, thank you for putting that on the table first. Ron? I've got that written down. What flavor is that, my friend?
All around love, so this commandment I give you that you love one another, I don't think it was meant by Christ. I don't think it's meant by Christ here to talk about, oh, this is a whole new law of instruction like you had before in detail that we're talking about here. The commandment I've given you, love, and how you show that to one another, how the fruits we just talked about being part of that.
Very good. Thank you. Kyle?
I don't think it's an accident that he's already mentioned the phrase fulfill the law. And when he did, he was speaking of the old law, but he tied it to love. And so now he's going to say fulfill the law of Christ.
So I'm going to step in just a minute so everybody makes that connection. So Kyle notes that we've talked about fulfill the law one more time, once before in chapter 5 and verse 14. The whole law is fulfilled in a word, love your neighbor as yourself. And here he's talking about fulfilling the law again, the law of Christ. Sorry, now go ahead.
I think Ron's exactly right. If you asked a Jew in that day, what's the law of Moses? They would say, it's what Moses commanded through God.
Yes.
Well, what did Jesus command? Go through the gospel. Where's his list of commands? It's John 13:35. It's love like I have loved you. And Paul seems to take that and say, maybe the greatest depiction of that is shown in how you treat the brethren and bearing their burdens.
Excellent. So that point, that fulfilling the law, again, that John 13 idea, a new commandment I give to you. John reiterates this in 1 John chapter 2. This new commandment based on love. I know it was talked about last class. Love is mentioned first as the aspects of the fruit. Is that a primary distinction? Leave that to your study, but it is interesting that it's first, and then we kind of get to this idea. Other thoughts on the law of Christ? Yes, sir.
And that includes Christianity itself.
Okay, so the law of Christ kind of encapsulates what it is. That what you're saying there? Christianity is the law of Christ. I think that's a fair equation to make. Other thoughts on the law of Christ? What, John? Yes. James chapter 2, law of liberty, yes? Yes.
Christ, of course,
Yes. I think, John, I think that's an excellent point. And in context, in this book specifically, with everything that we've talked about, if we kind of pull that out and say, all right, there's a law of Christ, now let's start writing down all of the things that we have to make sure that we checklist on the law of Christ, we've probably missed the whole point of Galatians, right? That this is intended to be a contrast to the law of Moses, that the whole book here is about, do you not understand how under the law of Moses is slavery, and it's no justification, and it's constant pursuit of impossible perfection, and is this structure of laws and ordinances that are never going to be able to be perfectly fulfilled. Like, you do understand that that's what you're going after, and so now to use this law of Christ, I think is certainly intentionally meant to be a contrast. That it's not to be like, here's how the law of Christ is like the law of Moses, but it's to say how it's completely different. I think if we take that in a different way, I fear that we may be losing the point of what Paul is saying here. Any other thoughts on that? So let me ask this question that I've thought a little bit about over the last few weeks in our conversations. Do you think that the outcome, just think about the outcome of a sincere seeker trying to live under the law of Moses versus a sincere seeker trying to live under the law of Christ? Which do you think results in a better moral outcome? More virtue, more morality. Under which of those results, I won't say expectation of a higher moral outcome, but in a higher morality?
I look at the Mosaic law as like legislating that
Yes.
it doesn't involve.
So Carol notes that the old law turned into a legislating of the spelling out of the requirements. And there's certainly a high level of morality that was expected under the old law. But as I thought about this, and this is just for thought, I think that perhaps the expectation or the result of someone who is under the new law is even a higher, more spiritual, higher level of morality, the fruit of the Spirit growing in that person to a higher level than under the old law. And that is despite the so-called, the requirements, the legislation, the laws, the things that we have to hold ourselves to being far less. I think that is a very interesting comparison. I'm not sure that's not part of what Paul is saying here. I'm not sure I'm getting my thoughts right. Just a thought. These questions that we ask about, how large should my contribution be? Or how much overtime is too much in my secular job? Or how much discipline should I give my kids and how much is too much? And how much should I lend to my neighbor? And how short is too short for a skirt? all of those questions and those like them, I just picked those out because I thought they were practical. Under the old law, things like that had very strict traditional definitions. And under the new law, this law of Christ, we are intended to struggle with all of them, I think. That we have to, in our hearts, as our spirituality grows, wrestle with all of those questions internally to find the right answer. John? Yes. 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 So that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who are led not by the law, but by the Spirit. Yes.
I thought about your question quite sincere seeker is something produced in different in the law of Christ and the law of Moses.
Yes.
Were people in the Old Testament led by the Spirit? That has to be yes. Quite literally.
To some extent, yes.
See it.
Yes.
They are being literally led by the Spirit. But what did it produce? One of the, thinking through the Old Testament, one of the outliers to that Samuel is guided by the Spirit. And it seems to produce in him not an arrogancy, not a complaining, not a I'm going to do things for my will, but just sincerely seeking to see the will of God accomplished in his life. But outside of him and maybe a couple others, people were led by the Spirit, or had the Spirit of God come upon them. And at the end of the day, it produced, in some cases, even more rebellion. Whereas now, under the law of Christ, the Spirit leads us and it produces God's character.
Spirit's in us. I would even add beyond that.
Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 both play a big part in it.
Yes. So there is this promise of a time when a new flesh, a new heart, a new spirit under the old law. And I would leave this to your study, but what is the difference in that sincere seeker in the new covenant, that this fruit of the Spirit continues to grow and we become more and more Christ-like, I would argue in a way that wasn't realistic under that old set of commands. Ms. Carroll.
Michael, I look at the old law and say, do not murder.
Yes.
Christ says, if we think we want to do away with something,
Yes.
sin.
Yes.
So I think it gives us a moral
And,
being led by the Spirit.
and so, that leads me to, yeah,
And you can't legislate morals.
I think we've seen that proven.
But just connected to that, did God intend for that to also produce in them the very things that Jesus spoke about in the Sermon on the Mount? Did God intend for do not murder to produce in them I should not hate? I think that He did.
I think you probably did.
And I think you get to Micah and you see God expected all along. Here's a very rigid law, and I want to be careful not to say that these things could not have been produced. God comes around later and says,
You should have.
"This should have done it."
That's right.
And that's not to say that. Again, that's not to say that the law was not capable, but that it goes to highlight the significance of the Spirit being in our lives and grace.
I think that is what I kind of wanted to get to, Kyle, the significance of the Spirit under this new law in our lives, that the fruit of the Spirit growing in our lives under the new law. I think perhaps we get uncomfortable if we say, but if we don't have this list of requirements, then morality will be abandoned. And I think that doesn't put enough value, enough respect on what the Spirit does in genuine believers, that we're saying that for genuine believers, the impact of that is going to be a higher morality, not just trying to clear some arbitrary hurdle of morality as set forth in the law, but to try to excel to a higher level, to be more Christ-like, and that setting these arbitrary levels of this is what it means to be good probably is counterproductive. That God intends us to wrestle with higher and higher levels of gentleness and goodness and joy and peace, that those things are intended to grow and abound, not to clear some check box under the old law, but it's going to be higher. I hope that makes sense as I thought through some of those things. We didn't have a chance to get to sowing and reaping, to the flesh and the Spirit, but I hope you see how that completely follows his idea. If we continue to put our thoughts and ideas behind these things, the Spirit's going to grow within us, and just the opposite to the flesh. The focus on the flesh will have negative consequences for the Galatians and for us. We've only got one more section of Scripture to go over on Wednesday. That'll be verses 11 through 18 as we finish up the book of Galatians. Thank you very much for your thoughts this morning.